Have you ever thought of a friend, just thought of them, and just at that exact moment, the phone rings and it's them? Why did you think of them at that exact moment? And how did they know to call just then? Welcome to Truly Terrified, Paranormal versus Physics, where we talk about some really weird stuff, and Joe the Scientist explains how it's not possible, or maybe it is. I'm Lynn, and
I'm Joe.
Telepathy is a form of extrasensory perception, or ESP. And we've talked about this before, like what's the difference? Extrasensory perception is like an umbrella term for a whole bunch of different things. Telepathy involves communication of thoughts or ideas by means other than your known senses. So if somebody is telepathic, they're able to read other people's thoughts or to send messages to someone else without using any audible words or gestures at all. Or maybe both. I mean, they can't do anything other than just in their mind. Telepathic ability hasn't been scientifically proven, and most scientists think it's fake or attribute it to intuition or luck. But there are many people who believe they're telepathic. Have you ever had a situation where you felt like you got a message that you couldn't explain how you got it?
A message like from another person?
Well, that just like you had knowledge of something.
Oh, okay.
You know.
And so, again, I think we've been over this, but the distinguishing factor between clairvoyance and this, or premonition and this, is that it's a person sending the message.
Yes.
I don't know, maybe, but I can't think of.
Or have you ever thought of something and then the person you were with just said the thing you were thinking of? Just some discrete thing?
I don't think anything maybe, but I've forgotten if so.
Okay.
I think that's something I would have forgotten, but I think there are certain circumstances, certainly, where it's been there's clearly a similar line of thought, and that's why we both thought of it, you know?
Yeah. I've had the phone thing happen lots and lots and lots of times, especially when I had a landline. Not so much with a cell phone, and also just because I don't know that many people who would call me anyway. But very often it used to be when I had a wider circle of acquaintances that actually would occasionally call me. I would, all of a sudden it would just pop in my head, this person, and then the phone would ring. Or even more often, I would, without even realizing why, I would reach for the phone.
Oh,
and then it would ring.
That kind of thing has happened to me. Really crazy coincidences that seem like they would be really unlikely.
Yeah.
Again, the law of large numbers, you would actually experience unlikely things all the time, but
it sure feels significant.
It feels much more significant. Now, if you were to amaze, you could magically normalize all those probabilities and look what's the real chance of that? And it's really low.
Yeah.
Then,
Well, so if you get 0 phone calls per day.
Yeah, so if you get 0 phone calls per day, and then it just so happens that on this particular day, and you never think of this person.
Yes.
You think of the person and the phone rings immediately.
Yes.
That's so unlikely.
Okay,
It'd be I imagine this scenario every time this happens to me. It's comical. It's you're walking, you've walked 1,000 miles. And
which you have.
There have been no issues. And you haven't seen a single person. And you haven't tripped or anything weird has happened. And then the first person you see, you as you slowly approach them, and the moment you pass them, you trip. It's what are the chances? Now, there may be correspondence, the reason why the person called and the reason why you thought of them is you both saw something that triggered that response.
Yes, but what are the chances of both seeing something at the same time?
Exactly.
Okay, so I put out a call for responses.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Ariel, I think Ariel is her name, or Ariel. She's a twin. So when she and her twin were 15 years old, this is what she said, quote, "I was in my old childhood home. My sister was home and I was in another part of the house. I had a tune running through my head, and it was one I knew for a fact she did not know. It played in my head, and then she hummed it."
So the other person had like had never heard this.
Okay, so
So presumably it's like,
even if they both had heard it on like a radio, you know, I don't know how long ago they were 15 years old, so maybe it was 20 years ago. I think people still listen to the radio now, but not as frequently, maybe. But let's just say let's just say they both heard it, not together, but at one point on the radio, and it just really didn't go into their heads, but it's in there. Even that she's thinking about it and her sister hummed it would be an interesting thing.
Yeah. It's like, okay, let's say it's paranormal. There's a mechanism, some causal model, why that happened. You know, like maybe it's like souls, and there's like this complex soul dynamic of information exchange, and soul particles are shooting around. But imagine if it's literally just a coincidence. I've said this before. If it's just a coincidence, and you cannot say, oh, this caused that, ever. You could have it so there's coincidence after coincidence after coincidence after coincidence. Every time it's super improbable, and you still cannot say that this caused that.
The fact that you cannot prove it now is meaningless to me, because at one point you couldn't prove electricity existed. You couldn't you couldn't prove germs existed. You couldn't prove the earth was round. So the fact that you cannot prove it is meaningless.
So imagine like it'd be like you like talk into a radio, and someone is listening, and as they go farther and farther out, the radio becomes more and more fuzzy. You know, you talking, they can hear you less and less, and it just gets more and more noisy. And at some point, it's all noise. They can't hear anything. But then it would be like, at some point, you know, thousands more miles down the line, they suddenly start getting the signal again. Not because it's bouncing off the atmosphere, not because of anything, but that the signal is somehow rising above the noise. And not just rising above the noise, but it's because of the noise that the signal is rising above it. What I mean by that is, it's like the butterfly thing. You know, the butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and there's a tornado in Arkansas or whatever. There obviously is some influence from the butterfly to the tornado. You can't, at some point though, because of all the noise involved, of other things interacting with this system, you can't say the butterfly caused the thing.
Okay, so this next story might be a little bit more striking.
Okay,
and we're going to go on the assumption we're going to believe these people.
Okay.
We're not going on the assumption that they're
assume that
deliberately lying or anything. I do want to say that this goes back to what exactly is thought, and where does it go when you think it. So just keep that in mind. So if this is still in Ariel, she said, quote, I was in a restaurant, seated at a table, waiting for my food. My sister had been stalked by an ex the prior month. Seeing a man seated alone at a table across from us, she thought it was her stalker. I looked at him and closed my eyes. In my mind, I held the image of his face, and as I did so, spoke in my mind the words, please turn around. My sister has been stalked, and we need to see if you are her stalker. I explained that I was speaking to him with my mind, that this was not his imagination, this was real, and telling him the location of our table in relationship to where he was. He turned around and stared at me with a puzzled expression on his face. It was apparent he had never had such an experience before. Now, it is true, if you stare at somebody, they can sense they're being stared at.
I think there's a term for that, but it's like, because our brains are so optimized for detecting eye orientation from other people, you can pretty much, it's like, try it. Look at a person, any person on the street, and they can detect, they'll look.
Okay, in this case, her eyes were closed.
Yeah, so presumably it wasn't like she was staring you know, that would, if you do that, they're going to look at you and they're going to be puzzled.
Especially if he had a companion sitting at the table with him who
the one thing,
not even have noticed.
How did she know he was looking at her when she had
She obviously opened up her eyes and saw that he was looking at her.
So even in that moment, presumably even in that moment, he could have looked over.
Yeah.
The eye effect targeting, like people detecting are being looked at, is amazingly fast. It's like the thing, like if you just pan over somebody, even if it's just saccades, your eyes, the natural eye jumping.
Yeah.
It lands on them for a few milliseconds.
Yeah.
It's probably on the order of, I'd estimate, 20 milliseconds that they can do this.
Wow.
But assuming there is a certain paranormal thing going on, I think we've talked about this before, but you have to question, how did the thoughts get from her to him?
Mm-hmm. And that's why I say, what is a thought?
Yeah,
where does a thought go once you think it?
So in the case of idealism, metaphysical idealism, there doesn't necessarily have to be any mechanism that we would recognize physically for there to be thoughts exchanged, because thoughts are higher order, higher up in the food chain than like the means of exchange of thoughts.
Okay.
So like if I just am speaking in my head, that actually supersedes like the words I would say, like the sound waves, which don't necessarily exist as you think of them in idealism. In physicalism, though, there has to be a means of exchange. Now, it could be a physical means we don't understand, like thought particles are shooting out, or some quantum mechanical effect. But there does have to be a means of exchange. And if it's physical, the means of exchange probably propagates at some rate. And it would be like, okay, if you're not like oriented towards them, there might be an effect of your orientation. You're either broadcasting it or you're tight beaming it. You're shooting it out in a beam.
And that is an important distinction, because if somebody's saying, I'm going to call my friend on the phone, and you just send that out, then everybody would reach for their phone and pick it up right before it rings. And then,
so if they're your friends, then, or maybe, if you have a picture of them. And
so there's some way that something else is going on.
Yeah.
Okay. While the existence of telepathy hasn't been proven, some parapsychological research studies have produced positive results. For decades, physicists have speculated that if bridge were played with cards, following the principles of quantum mechanics, something resembling telepathy might be possible. Bridge being a card game. Now, researchers in China have experimentally demonstrated this phenomenon known as quantum pseudo-telepathy. Not in quantum bridge, but in a two-player quantum competition called the Merman-Perez Magic Square, MPMS game. In this game, players must coordinate their actions without communicating with each other. When used effectively, quantum pseudo-telepathy enables the players to win every round of the game, a perfect performance that would be unattainable under classical rules. The experiment conducted uses laser photons and explores the boundaries of how quantum mechanics allows information to be shared between particles. I will pass this article link to you.
That's really interesting.
Yes,
I've never heard of that.
It is interesting, and it was in Scientific American, and so
a lot of things like that in quantum physics, it's like you can have entangled pairs of particles, and you can't exchange classical information, but you can know what will happen if somebody measures something, even no matter how far away they are, because the particles are entangled. In that situation, I'm guessing that's what it is. So they can't like for instance, somebody can't be looking at their cards and then beam over to somebody else what their cards are. It's more like somebody has a deck of cards and they pass the cards out, and by virtue, and they're like quantum entangled cards. So, and so just by virtue of looking at your cards, you know what the probability that this other person has, certain cards, higher than the probability of just card counting.
So after you read this article, we should do another episode where you can explain this, if it's explainable to people like me.
Yeah, and in a lot of cases, the explanation is not what you'd expect. It's not like, telepathy is an easy thing to communicate. I think something and they pick it up.
Yeah.
But it's not always so with like quantum computing,
more
related stuff, and quantum information theory and whatever.
I found loads of people on the internet, loads of them, who are looking for telepathy partners because they want to experiment with it, which I think is pretty cool. And I found many, many more who believe the voices in their heads are telepathic messages. And this is the problem because they sound like they have mental illness.
So here's the thing. Let's say there is telepathy. I've been hammering on this almost every episode. Let's say there is telepathy. It's an actual paranormal phenomena. It's a real thing. It's measurable, whatever. Also, what's a real thing is schizophrenia. So no matter what, you can't just assume a voice in your head is telepathy.
Right.
Even if you know it could be, that it's a real phenomenon. You have to be able to distinguish it somehow from mental illness.
I think it's kind of like the Christians who say that they speak in tongues. So the rule is, according to the Bible, that if somebody stands up in a church meeting and speaks in tongues, someone else must be able to interpret it for it to be truly from God. Okay, so just keep that model in mind, because for it to be a telepathic experience, you have to be able to identify somebody sent you the message.
So consider this. This is actually much like the quantum information exchange thing. You have a telepathic message is from person Y. And so you go to them and you have to confirm it. So you go to them and ask, what was your message? And they say the message. How did you get the information? Was it the communication or them telling you the message? You have to confirm it.
Right.
So,
that is the problem. That is totally the problem. Okay, so I'm making a segue. There is no segue. I'm just jumping into another topic here.
Okay.
Because I don't want you to think that I am saying that the person I'm going to speak about next is schizophrenic. Because I don't necessarily believe that.
Yeah.
But one of the people I have communicated with, his name is Arash. So I'm going to go with the pronunciation I found online, which is awkward.
Okay, sounds good.
I think that's how you pronounce it, Arash Safavi. And he lives in Stockholm, Sweden. And he says he's created an app that will sense and locate telepathic intrusions, or as he puts them, voices around you.
My name is Arash, and I'm basically an entrepreneur working on this telepathy stuff. So this is slightly complicated. As you probably know, there isn't many people who would say that telepathy exists even. But of course, I'm not one of those. My whole work is, or like this business and the app and other stuff that I do, like the whole startup that I'm trying to do is about telepathy. So it's obviously I wouldn't be a person who would say it doesn't exist. And I have my personal experience in its existence.
So I'll put a link in the show notes to his website where the app runs from your browser. I braved it after you assured me it was probably not going to install some sort of malware on my phone, and as far as I can tell, it did not. So Arash said that you take your phone and you move it around while the app is running, and if there is a telepathic conversation where you are pointing your phone, it will show a tick mark or check mark, as we say in the United States, and if there isn't, it shows a cross or X, as we would say. So I wandered all around our house and the yard, and unfortunately I tried to record video as I was doing this, but my phone would not allow me to record video at the same time this app was running, because I had to look at the app to see what it was doing.
Yeah.
And so if I was in the recording mode, the app wasn't running. If I was in the app, recording wasn't running. So in the kitchen, toward the front window, I got a hit. I thought it was perhaps from the windows, so I went around to all the windows. No other window did this, and it didn't produce the same results. So then I went outside and I went to the grave. Thought, well, if there's anything goofy out here, we're going to see it from the grave. No results. But then I turned towards the street in the same direction as that window where I got the hit before, and I got a hit again. And really, if you triangulated it, it would be in the same exact position that it was pointing at. Here is where I did not understand. And he actually said this to me, but I thought because of possible language barriers, I thought he was using this wrong pronoun in what he said. So Arash explained it this way. Quote, "It is technically showing you where my location is." I thought he was speaking as if from my point of view. He was not. He was literally saying, it is technically showing you where Arash is, not where you are. And then he said, I figured I have all these sounds around me, so if I made an app that shows my location, it would indirectly show the location of the voices. And this is the app. Now, I've since received a recording from him, and because of the time change and the time difference between Sweden and here, he just sent it to me, and so there was no interaction. I've asked him some more questions, but he hasn't responded because he's probably asleep at this point in time, because it would be the middle of the night in Sweden, if I'm remembering correctly how the time changes in that part of the world. So because I didn't understand that the app shows where he is, and I thought it was showing where the source of any telepathic communications were, I was pretty disappointed. But he explained this about future developments in his app.
So the ultimate app would be that you would make an application like on a smartphone, using smartphones, and you would tell people to point to the sounds or point to the telepathic sounds that they're hearing. And in this, the hypothesis is, my own hypothesis is that people would have a larger tendency to point to a specific place, and that place is the location where they're hearing, or the direction that they're hearing the telepathic sounds from. And as I mentioned, multiple people would be pointing to the same location, and the app could gather this type of data using the sensors in the phone, and like you could gather where people are pointing to in real time in like databases, and interject those directions and find the point that people are pointing at. So people would have a larger tendency to point to where they're hearing the sounds from. That's the hypothesis.
Again, a link to Arash's webpage with his app is in the show notes. Thank you to Arash Safavi for his contribution to this episode. He sounds perfectly reasonable, and I think that's my point. So I'd be remiss if I didn't include the following information. Individuals with schizophrenia may experience delusions that they can read others' thoughts or that others can read their minds. That's often part of a broader pattern of thought disturbances or paranoia. They might have auditory hallucinations that they interpret as telepathic communication, though these are more accurately described as hearing voices rather than actual telepathy. Because schizophrenia affects perception and cognition, experiences that might seem like telepathy to the person with schizophrenia are actually symptoms of their condition. So in my opinion, the most important part, if you think you're getting a message from another human being, is to confirm with that human being that they sent you a message. Is thought simply energy?
That's bait.
If thought is energy, in the way that you described it in our last episode as being something that can move something else, if thought is actually energy, couldn't it travel through the air like electricity can and like sound can and affect somebody else's brain?
Well, there's just a lot of issues with that model. It's not like a radio. A radio has a mechanism built in to listen for particular forms of energy, and you're talking about a form of communication that's much more complex. It would be very difficult to imagine some physical process exchanging complex information like that between two brains. And even in the case of there is some information exchange, probably a lot of the information is context or some common interaction between, like you already know some of the information. Telepathy is just filling in some details. Now, obviously, if the entire universe is not physical, then there's all sorts of other possible models how it works. Or if many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics works a particular way, it doesn't necessarily have to work this particular way. There might be classical information exchange between different versions of yourself or different people that you can't see. But as always, you can't rely on a model that you haven't confirmed yet. You have to be diligent, or else you very easily could be led astray by other factors.
Truly Terrified is a Salt of the Earth production. Tell us your story. Send us your comments. Obviously, we'll play your voice if you send it to us. You can send us a 3-minute voicemail at 715-575-9420 or text us at that same number. You can also email us at lynnandjoeonthego@gmail.com or contact us through Reddit. Our contact information is also in the show notes. Please share, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and never be so terrified you can't run.
You can't run.